So the talk is the integration of player emergent behaviour with procedural generation. I don't know the levels of how much you guys are into doing the programming, game design and things like that. So the first few slides are sort of covering the topics to the terms so that you know what I'm talking about when I say it. So when I talk about procedural generation, I mean the algorithmic creation of in-game content as opposed to the random creation. It's a delineation that's constantly confused by people. When you talk about random generation of a world or a texture map or even creature movement, things like that, you're talking about taking numbers out of a random number generator and creating the content based on that. However, if you're using a random number generator, it's hard to actually recreate that unless you're actually controlling the seeds. Whereas procedural generation is taking an algorithm, some sort of process that's fixed based on a certain number of factors such as player coordinates, and then using that data to create a stream of content. So that's what I mean when I was saying procedural generation. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about things that you see in games such as Minecraft, which uses a fractal system or a modified fractal system to create these large-scale environments. Whereas if I generate a world in Minecraft using the seed 1, 2, 3, 4, and I give you the same seed on your computer, even though they're not connected in any way, you'll see the same world because it used the same seed and it was generated in the same way. So a lot of people see procedural generation as a bit of a novelty, and that's why you don't get it used commonly in games. You'll use it in small scale, like who here has played Ski Safari? Brilliant game, amazing game. Probably the single biggest reason that Malevolence isn't finished yet. It uses procedural generation to generate ski slopes so that you get the same. I'm not sure if it does anymore. It's changed quite a bit since I forced myself to stop playing it. But you always get the same ski slope, but it would go on as long as you need it to be. So as opposed to something like random generation, which you would get in a game like Jetpack Joyride, another fantastic game and another massive time sink for me, where the content coming across, the positioning of coins, platforms and things like that, more of a random generation as it comes through, because it doesn't necessarily matter if it's the same every time. So people often use procedural generation sparingly, like in something like Ski Safari, because it suits that purpose very well. But if you try and generate an entire world with procedural generation, you start seeing repetition, essentially, even if it's on an unconscious level, because procedural has a look to it. And if you've ever played a game such as, any Elder Scrolls fans in the audience? Did you play Daggerfall? Still holds the record of being one of the largest in-game video worlds, and it was 1994, I think, or something like that. But it was procedurally generated world. There were fixed locations that were hand designed, but all the space in between the hills and the forests and things like that, there was no way that game designers would be able to hand create a world that's 2 times the size of the entire British Isles. So they used procedural generation to lay all that out. However, anybody who's played Daggerfall knows that after 40, 50 hours of gameplay, you start seeing dungeons that are exactly the same as one that you were in just a few dungeons ago, and you start seeing forests that have exactly the same layout just because these patterns form. So what my talk about today is how to actually overcome that repetition in procedural generation and make it more of a viable content creation tool, and take it out of that spectrum of being a novelty for people and making it an actual practical tool. So there's some fantastic procedurally generated games out there already. If people don't recognize the top ones, Minecraft. Second one is a new game coming out. I'm not sure if it's out yet. No Man's Sky. Very, very cool. I've been hearing a lot of great reviews from people who have managed to play it. However, the same thing that I'm hearing all the time is that eventually you start getting to planets and you see the same thing over and over again. You've got millions upon millions of planets that you can visit and explore, but after a while they all just start looking the same. And below that is a lesser known game. It's called K. Krieger. It was actually a competition entry, and the entire game is procedurally generated, including the textures, the sounds, the 3D models. It's all done algorithmically, and the entire game, even with graphics like that you can see there, is 96 kilobytes in size. It unpacks to end up being about 2 gigabytes worth of content when you experience the entire thing. But that's amazing when you think about it. I mean, you can't even compile a Hello World program these days with it being bigger than 96 kilobytes. So some great examples of procedural generated worlds, but that repetition is a core problem. Minecraft is a good example of how that problem can be overcome by putting in user-generated content, which is kind of what I'm going to be talking about, but not so much user-generated content, but the emergent behavior that comes from giving people the option to create user-generated content. So the reason that repetition happens is because computers, they're not creative, they're not people, they don't have minds, they can just follow instructions. And even if you give it a very good set of instructions, it still has to work within that range of instructions. And because of that, they're going to start repeating the same processes over and over again. It all comes down to maths. I mean, writing a program is just a large mathematical formula, and that maths is going to create patterns. Even a random number generator will start putting out patterns occasionally just out of chance. So you can't rely on it. So the solution, you would think, would be to make a computer that can think, a computer that is creative, innately creative, and can come up with new, genuine, interesting content. However, we already have access to one, and that is the human brain. And it happens anyway, regardless of whether you want it to. And that's where emergent behavior comes in. Emergent behavior is basically when you have crafted a game, a world, a set of tools within that world, even if that set of tools is just the ability to move through a 3D world, and then players, without you having designed this functionality, will come up with a way to do something in the game that benefits them or makes the game a little bit more interesting, and it starts to spread and becomes just the dumb thing in the game. A good example would be strafe jumping in Quake 3 Arena. It was never designed to actually happen. It was just a weird quirk of the physics, and they rolled the game out, happened to be in there, and people have, if you've ever played the defrag mod for Quake 3 Arena, people have made entire communities based on using things like rocket jumping and strafe jumping to get through insane obstacle courses. Now that was never actually intended or planned by id Software, but it became such a huge thing that it was too awesome to actually patch out. You don't see that sort of thing happening, oh, we better fix that, better get rid of strafe jumping. Did you ever play the Creatures series back in the late 90s, I think that was? It was great games, but if you bred them wrong or did the wrong thing, they started getting a little bit mutated and a bit dumb, or they wouldn't breed properly and things like that. A bit like running a real zoo. Once again, not designed, not put in there, but because of the way the game happened to work, ended up being the case. Over many, many generations, things could go wrong. EverQuest ended up having a real-world economy equivalent. People were actually taking an item that they had bought in the game using gold that they had farmed for and selling it on eBay for real money. And it actually got to the point where I think the EverQuest world had the 16th best economy in the world for a while there, in the real world. So that's a video game world having that. That was never planned to happen, and actually did end up cracking down on it, but it still happened anyway in this sort of black market scheme of things. So another cool example of it happening. But the biggest one that I've seen was in EVE Online. Any EVE Online players here? Yeah, great game, but a while back, sorry? Yeah, a while back there was a bit of a scandal where there was one guy or a group of guys, I'm not entirely sure of the details, but he worked his way up through these alliances, and basically the entire universe of EVE Online is controlled by these sort of guild-like things called alliances, and they control everything about the game, but you can actually disband them and build new ones and things like that, and create this sort of in-game economy. And this one person, through a huge amount of effort and time, worked their way up to actually be at the head of this entire structure, and then he dissolved the whole thing, just collapsed it completely. And the whole game world was left thinking, what the hell just happened? And they had to build it all back up. Now, you'd think that the game creators would actually come in and step in and say, all right, let's just sort of patch this up, rebuild the structure of everything, put everything back the way it was. But they actually stepped back and said, no, we're leaving it like this. We're going to start working with people's desire to do this sort of thing and start putting in new content that gives them more control over being able to do this, being able to monitor it. So there's new councils that actually oversee things and things like that. And the developers for EVE Online are fantastic when it comes to emergent behaviour, because they even have, I was saying just outside, there's a council of players that are elected by other players who ended up getting flown over to their headquarters, and they put forward ideas and desires of the players and saying, look, this needs to happen. And they'll actually take it on board, patch the game, and things change. I mean, how many developers do you know that actually are willing to do that for their players? And it just goes to show how important to a player base emergent behaviour can actually become. And it doesn't always have to be secretive either. I mean, these things turn out into mods. Most of the time, a mod community is made because the game developer, the original game developer, isn't doing something that the players want the game to do. So what I'm talking about is actually encouraging that as much as possible. A lot of people are they get a bit iffy about mods. They think, oh, you're touching my game, you're modifying my game. But if you actually help it, you can actually make part of the game be to mod the game. So that really brings up the subject of controlling the emergent behaviour, which you can do. You do have to be careful about it though, because if you are putting too much of an emphasis on guiding people in the way they behave in the game, then it's not emergent behaviour anymore. It's just behaviour. It's people playing the game how they're supposed to play it in your eyes, which is completely detracts from the point. So there's lots of tools, examples of people that are giving people these abilities to encourage emergent behaviour. In Minecraft, there's the redstone manipulation. I've seen people actually build entire PCs, that CPU systems with memory and whatnot that work and actually will run a game of Pong that two people can control just using redstone. I mean, that is incredible and could never have been thought that would happen, but it has, because of this open-ended set of tools. In Deus Ex, getting through levels using the wall-mounted mines, that was kind of fun. It's going back a while. It's a pretty early example of emergent behaviour, but it was very popular at the time. Dwarf Fortress, the huge communities around that actually will give you, I mean, the detail that game goes into in its ability of what you can do is staggering, and do encourage you, if you're into procedural generation, to check out Dwarf Fortress. And in the Scribblenauts series, if everyone's ever played those, very fun games, great for kids if you've got them, but it really pushes your creativity because they've tried to predict emergent behaviour in some creative ways. Basically, if you haven't played the game, you'll be given a problem that's kind of a bit like The Incredible Machine, if you remember that game. But you can write down the word of something that you want to include that you think would make the problem get solved, and it will appear in the game. And I'm talking about virtually anything. I've actually written a leopard in a top hat, and it's appeared. They've actually they've done up the graphics for this thing, and it appears in the game, and it might help me solve the problem. So that's towing the line of what I was talking about. We'll get to that a bit later. So what actually made me want to give this talk was my own game, Malevolence, which I'm not here to talk about today, but it is a good example of what happens with this. People who've come to the Game On Symposium, that probably heard me talking about this before, but I actually had, it's an infinite game world, and all of the items in it are procedurally generated. So what happened was, on their own, several of the players, the more higher ranking players, formed a competition on the forums and said, we'll videotape or screen capture your progress, and you'll go into Shobanor, one of the bigger dungeons in the game, and fight your way all the way to the bottom and all the way to the top with a new character. Videotape the whole thing, put it up on the forums, and we'll see who can do it first without dying, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. So they did this, and by the end of the competition, they had hundreds of people on the forums following along and liking the progress and commenting and discussing strategy. Where it ended off at the one video, they'd say, oh, you totally need to go and do this, and this huge sub-forum ended up being created for it just to discuss this competition. And by the end of it, two people ended up winning at the same time, and their equipment that they had became sought after. in the game, you can actually swap items with other people using these things called dimension stones. And people wanted the items of these players, not because they could use them themselves, but they're kind of like a bit of celebrity memorabilia. And so we had these swords and helmets and things like that that were legendary items. Now, if you've ever played an RPG before, especially an online RPG, legendary items are a huge part of that. But the thing is, they've all been handwritten by somebody. There's some game designer, someone that's gone, you know, the beheader of Lacteth, and put stats on it and all that sort of thing. And they even write a bit of a snippet of backstory behind it and that sort of thing, and then push it out into the game, and then everybody gets excited about this new axe that they can find. However, the items that people wanted in Malevolence at this time actually had stories. They had a little snippet of history behind them that had actually happened. And the name that was given to them was something that was just out of the procedural generation system. It wasn't something that was handwritten. So people were actually referencing their weapon by the name of the weapon in the game, rather than just say, oh, just use your sword. It would be use the slayer of whatever. And by the end of it, these items were being passed around and swapped for all sorts of manner of gold and other items and things like that, because they were legendary weapons. And that was entirely done through this emergent behaviour. I had no part in organising any of this. I had no part in the creation of the weapons. It was just something that happened. And it got me thinking, these people went and did this anyway, so how could I actually give them more tools to be able to encourage that sort of behaviour? Because when it comes down to it, Malevolence is an infinite world, and because of that it means infinite repetition. There's only so many times you can see a certain dungeon and before they all start looking the same, or visit a town before they all start looking the same, or even looking at items. So if I wanted to keep creating new, interesting content, I already have this audience of people that are willing to do it on their own. They made these items that were just another procedurally generated item into something that was special and desired and everybody wanted. So that's what sort of birthed this talk. So I've analysed it, and I've figured out that the reason that procedural generation seems unnatural and hand-created things seem natural is because of predictable chaos, is what I'm calling it. You can actually have something like nature. For example, a sunflower, set of sunflower seeds, like I've got in this picture here, they actually follow the same pattern. Every sunflower seed position in a sunflower is actually, it follows a Fibonacci sequence spiral down into the center. They all follow exactly the same thing, but they're all slightly different. You'd never find two that look identical. So it's sort of predictable chaos. You can say, yes, they will always follow a Fibonacci sequence spiral in the center of a sunflower, but how are they different? The way it makes it different is that little bit of chaos, and that's what makes you be able to say no two sunflowers are alike. Same thing works in a procedural game world. You can have that formula and say that it's always going to follow this pattern, but you need that little bit of chaos to actually make it seem like it's different, seem like it's a new experience. So you need something that will behave randomly, and a random number generator isn't enough to do it. And I know this from trying it. A random number generator will still pump out something that is cold. To actually make it seem natural, you need to actually implement a natural element, which is that human element, the procedural, the emergent behaviour of the people. So what you want to see is the random human element simulated in a PC, and the only way to do that is with a cleverly balanced set of tools. So what I've said here, if you are observing a large group of people, you'll notice that in general they all act the same. If you look at humanity in general, just in Brisbane, they wake up around the same time of the day, they go to work, do their job, they'll eat lunch at lunchtime, they'll go home around 5 o'clock, and they'll do miscellaneous activities until it gets to Friday, and then some of them might go out. You can actually start seeing these patterns that form en masse, but amongst them there are all these anomalies, and it's those anomalies that actually create that chaos. So you want to actually try and create that, because when I say emergent behaviour, not everybody's going to do it. Only anomalies are going to do it, and you want to try and help them, guide them do it. So think of it like the Matrix. Remember in the Matrix how they'd planned out this when he was talking to, I think it was the Oracle, she said they kept trying to build new matrices, and they kept being rejected because there wasn't a choice that the people had available to them. So the same sort of works in a game world. It's sort of a discussion on the same thing. If you give a cold procedural world that's just based on a cold mathematical formula and nothing else, eventually people are going to get bored with it. And if you're going to do something like I did with Malevolence and make an infinite world, what's the point of doing that if people are just going to get bored with it in the same amount of gameplay hours as you could have gotten from a handcrafted world like Skyrim? So, I mean, you could happily play Skyrim for 80 hours and not get bored. If people can only play Malevolence for 80 hours before getting bored, then I may as well have just given up on the whole procedural thing and done something handcrafted, which would have ended up giving just as much entertainment. So what you want to try and do is give them that feeling of choice, give them that feeling of ownership of the world. When that player traded some valuable item for that legendary weapon that was created amongst the community, there was no sort of conscious awareness that it's still just a digital item. It became something different. I mean, anybody that's played MMOs for a decent length of time, or known somebody that's played MMOs for a decent length of time, the special item that they've just gotten from killing some particular big monster is more than just a small few kilobytes of data in their computer. It has value to them, just like a real physical object would. And to actually create that, you need to actually encourage that feeling to happen. It's got to break out and become more of a human element. So what I've got here is if you add one human-controlled factor, like in Minecraft, for example, the redstone, the ability to create these moving things, there's no limit on what you can build, but there are still rules that you have to follow with using redstone. If you add multiple of them, you can actually completely tame a procedural world and make it not seem... I mean, people will still get bored with it eventually. That's just the nature of video gaming, but you can make it so that it is always fresh. However, it does take a certain amount of thought that goes into the balance behind it, because if you allow it to get out of hand, it will... it'll turn on you and ruin the entire gaming experience. But at the same time, if you try and control it too much, it will not be emergent behavior, it will just be people playing the game. So if you end up going too far to the latter way, you'll end up with Little Big Planet, which is a great game, but it didn't really stir the masses as much as I think that they were planning for it to, given the way that they were advertising it. So you're trying to... Unless you're deliberately aiming to make a sandbox game, you want to try and avoid it feeling too much like that. So let's just take an example, practical example of very, very basic rudimentary procedural generation. You can see here I've got this grid up the top of the x coordinates, down the side of the y coordinates. And we have our algorithm in the middle there of how our seed generation for each little chunk of our world is going to be generated. Very, very ridiculously straightforward one. Basically, you put in your x and your y coordinate of where you're standing, pump out a number, and then base the world around you on that number. And you end up looking like something like this. That can work really, really well. And it's the core of any procedurally generated world. You base the environment around the player on the player's coordinates. It's very straightforward. However, if you feed that into an engine that says, okay, when this set of conditions is made, put a tree here, and when this set of conditions is made, make a rock. Eventually, you're just going to see trees and rocks. Even if they're placed creatively, doesn't matter. It's still just going to hit a repetition point. So what you want to try and do is minimize the repetition as much as possible through the use of sort of taming and controlling that emergent behavior of the players that are playing in the world. So Spore was a great example of this being attempted, didn't quite take off. Basically, if you haven't played Spore, they allowed you to create a creature of pretty much any design you wanted within limitations. You could give it 6 legs or 2 legs or 1 leg, 4 mouths, 18 eyes, and it would work out a way to survive. And basically how you designed it showed you its odds of survival. But when you created it, actually would pump that creature you created off to their server, and other people that were playing the game would be playing completely single player, but they would travel to a new planet or community and they would see possibly your creation living there. Not controlled by you in any way, but because it was being created by people, you saw all these wonderful things. But the inevitable happened, and every planet you visited was covered in penis-shaped buildings with penis-shaped aliens running around and things like that. And it sort of went a bit crazy like that. You get that though, but Spore, they really tried. They did a great job, but it didn't end up being what they wanted. I mean, who here was actually reading about Spore and listening to the talks and things before it came out? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. They had, I mean, it's a Maxis game, so I mean, they have these huge, big, grandiose plans of what they wanted it to be, and then the reality kicked in. And the reason that it didn't work is because they basically said, we're not going to tether the emergent behaviour at all. We're going to let people just do whatever they want. And it sort of went, that was one of many factors, but it sort of went a bit crazy and fell off into nothing. They made good sales and whatnot because people were excited, and I'd love to see them actually try it again with a bit more of an adult version of it. But what they need to do is take a leaf out of the book of somebody like the creators of EVE Online so that they can get more of a hold on this. So pushing it further, Spore did it with just the creation of your creatures essentially. The rest of the game was entirely controlled. If you look at Minecraft, it really places all of the creation controls in your hands. You've got your limitations that you work with. Everybody's working in the same limitations, so it controls it quite nicely, it guides it, but at the same time it gives you ultimate freedom. You can, people still make lots of very large penis-shaped objects, but most of the time they make thriving communities online. They'll make intricate labyrinths with traps and things like that. They'll make scale reference size USS Enterprises, which is like 1:1 scale, which was incredible. Notre Dame Cathedral, things like that. One of the best things I've seen was 150 people working together for months to actually accurately recreate the Capitol in Game of Thrones. So I've actually been on that server and walked around. It's incredible. It can lead to incredible things. However, it's a sandbox that it's just going to be for them. If they're on a server together, that's fine. Everybody in that server sees it. As soon as you walk off that server and go to your home computer and play in single player, all of that emergent behavior is gone. It's just another blank world and you're back to starting from scratch again. It doesn't actually affect the ultimate overall gameplay of how the game evolves and develops. It just affects that server. So it's not thinking large enough scale. All it is giving you the tools to be able to create something in that scenario, but it doesn't actually affect the game. The game hasn't changed. The game is not polymorphic at all. It's just still a static constant. Little Big Planet was the same thing. You could create all these wonderful things, but it didn't actually affect the game for anybody else. Spore touched on it right by the fact that when you created something, other people experienced it, and thus it changed the game. However, it was just on an aesthetic scale that didn't really affect anything. You could run into my creature that I created, or you could run into my wife's creature that she created. It wouldn't make a difference. They're still the same, follow the same patterns. So it doesn't actually affect the gameplay, it's just aesthetic. So what you need to do is actually take the behavior of what people are doing and make it affect the game, the way the game works, the way the game operates. So that's what I was talking about with EVE Online. When that structure of guilds and alliances collapsed, that affected everybody. Because people actually had the ability to open a store, essentially. They have what is it? It's like an express delivery system store that people have created. What it does is expressly delivers missiles to a particular person you don't like. You just be flying along, and all of a sudden all these ships will warp around you, and then boom, and then they'd bugger off before the authorities can get there. But that also wasn't designed. It was an emergent thing, but that starts affecting other people because there is one EVE Online server. It's not like instances in World of Warcraft where you'll be here and you don't get affected by the rest, the greater scale of things. In EVE Online, everything affects everybody else. So that's what you want. That's the example that you want to try and go for. So on one side, it is a very fine line. On one side, you've got a sandbox open world filled entirely with user-generated content. I'm talking like Minecraft, where It's just that world, nothing else. And on the other side, you've got games like, the Quake series or Call of Duty or something like that. It's a linear experience, hand-designed. Everything is done in a way that's going to be the same for every person. You want to try and find the very, very middle section of that. You want to have something that you have designed, but you've designed it to be open and free, if that makes sense. So what we've got here, I've done this little chart. So in the top left, you've got an open world sandbox. Top right, you've got user-generated content. And down the bottom, you've got design-guided gameplay, like we were talking about with Call of Duty, etc. There are examples of crossovers between these styles of gameplay. Like, as you can see there, Minecraft is an open world sandbox filled with user-generated content. Skyrim is an open world sandbox, but it's completely spoon-fed to you. So what you want to try and do is be right in the middle there. You want to try and incorporate all three aspects of that in your game. Now, I'm not saying that all games need to use this. I'm assuming that you guys are here to hear me talk because you like procedurally generated games. You like the idea of a huge open world or something that's beyond the generation of a ski slope when it comes to procedural generation. So that's the sort of game I'm talking about. If you want to create the next Daggerfall and have that giant world, you want to be right in the middle there. You want to actually not ignore the design-guided gameplay, because the design needs to come in the form of the tools that you create for people to allow people to actually make use of their emergent behavior. So here are the specific problems that these crossovers ended up failing with because they didn't incorporate all three. So Skyrim, it is beautiful. It's incredible. Some of the scenes you see from it are fantastic, and that comes from it being hand-designed by people. They've specifically made every tree to look amazing. It's not some procedurally generated nonsense like Spore. You start getting some very bizarre-looking things. So there's no player-generated content or procedurally generated content unless you start going into mods. The actual original game, it's all spoon-fed to you. There is a very intricate quest system, very intricate item system and gear system, but it's been designed, the entire thing. Minecraft, fantastic set of tools. However, outside of those servers, the game's not affected by anything that you create. If I could invent something incredible, there's some new spaceship that actually will fly through the world, but it doesn't affect anybody else playing the game unless I actually bring them onto a server that I've done it, or put out the instructions somewhere of how to build it like a Lego kit. And Spore, the tile set was extremely limited, and everything they did was just, it affected the game visually and nothing else. So it didn't quite reach that far. They started down the right road, but they didn't quite push the envelope. So what you need to do is create tools that are balanced and fair and universal across everybody's gameplay experience. So a good example of a game that could make use of something like this is the Pokemon games. I mean, everyone's heard about Pokemon. The way they work, though, is everybody starts with the same Pokemon. You pick one of three and that's it. They've all got the same moves, same health, same everything. But if you take all these people that have been playing for 30 hours, you'll be very, very hard pressed to actually find two people that are perfectly equally balanced, because of the way that they have trained the Pokemon, the way that the direction that they've taken in the game, the strategies that they've developed. And because of that, all of that has just been human behavior that has made it get to that point, based on a set of tools that is universal, that everybody's using. So that sort of system of having encouraging the human behavior through a set of well-designed, balanced tools can make a procedural experience, like a game like Malevolence or Skyrim or something like that, in theory last forever, because the content that they're working with is made by players. So if we were to take it further, imagine if there was a system in the game of Pokemon where you could actually create your own moves. And then once you actually created those moves, they became available in other people's games. So not from any deliberate action of yours, but once you've created it, it automatically sends off to the server, and then somebody will stumble along and find that move and be able to train it to their Pokemon. That all of a sudden takes a game that had this much content and multiplies it multiple times. So you could, what if you started adding more functionality like that? Not necessarily just, Pokemon is just an example that I've picked. I mean, you may hate Pokemon. A lot of people do. But you can see how that one move could actually make the game so much bigger. The tools, of course, would have to be very carefully designed. They'd have to be well balanced. If you made them get too powerful, then it would ruin the entire game, make it not fun to play and things like that. So it does take a lot of research, it does take a lot of time. It's not the sort of thing you can just whip together quickly and punch out. Most of the time it takes research. Back in the day when games like this were being made, there wasn't the research because there wasn't a point of reference. There was nothing to actually look at. But now we're in this world where you have huge MMO communities that have been playing and really passionate about it too. EVE Online, as an example, there was a war in EVE Online that was not orchestrated by the developers. It was actually a war between these factions that was massive. It went for hours, something like 13 hours or something. It was ridiculous. But that just entirely procedurally player generated. So you want to actually try and push those limits. So when you're actually creating these tools, though, that allow people to do it, if that war, for example, had been allowed because of these tools that you can use of communication between other players, organising meetups and things like that to be able to get everyone together, if you had have made it so that incorrectly made it so that ships banding together actually got more powerful and then 6,000 people got together and just started annihilating everybody in the game, that ends up ruining the experience for everybody. So you've got to actually try and find the balance. So the pros of actually being able to implement player emergent behaviour is that it does hand over a large portion of content creation to your player base, which means less work for you, in theory. Creation of the tools and getting them balanced ends up making up that work for you. It presents a massive learning experience of player behaviour because, like I said, we've got this huge palette of games, particularly the emergence of indie games, that you can actually look at and research how people are behaving and responding to different types of content in a game. And there's heaps of examples of a player emergent behaviour in pretty much any game or any popular game that has a good player base. So you've got, if you start doing it yourself, especially with Malevolence, it's a beta game, it's an early access, so I'm actually developing it as people are playing it, which is in a good position for me to be in when it comes to trying to implement these tools. I can actually test them out, and if people don't like them or want them tweaked, I can actually do that in real time. Something to think about. But also, if it's accepted well by the players, it becomes a marketing tool. If you have this ability to do something cool in your game, the people talk about it. They bring other people because they say, oh, come and do this with me. Minecraft is a huge example of that. When people start teaming up to build things together, like I said, 150 people working together to make that city from Game of Thrones. However, there are downsides as well. Correctly balancing the tool set is a lot of work. You would think it's not, it starts getting very, very complex. The tiniest anomaly that you could put in there that may pass all scrutiny of your test team for levels 1 to 100 may completely blow out of proportion for that one guy that is very, very dedicated and gets to level 300 and then finds that the whole thing collapses. So when you're building a procedural tool, you actually have to have procedural testing to go with it, because if it can go on infinitely, the anomaly can grow infinitely. So there's something to keep in mind. You'll need to have a connection to a server, which a lot of people, if you haven't done it before, can be daunting, although with the advent of cloud technology and things, it's very, very straightforward. If you're going to do something where a player in one copy of the game does something and it affects a player in another copy of the game, that needs to be stored somewhere. And unless you're doing a direct connection between every PC, it starts getting a bit out of hand. So you need to actually have server creation, which does put certain limitations on games and things like that. You need to put in offline mode because a lot of people don't like being always online and things like that. So it's a consideration. And you have to make sure that the tools are either easy to use or they don't even realize that they're using them. Because if somebody's trying to build something in Minecraft and it's too difficult to build, they just won't build it. You'll get 1 or 2 people that actually are stubborn enough to stick it through. But the creature creation tool in Spore, for example, it's a good example because it's nice and straightforward to use. Unfortunately, it's because the tools are very limited. But if you are crafting something, creating something, for example, the ability to create new moves in Pokemon, like I was saying, the training simulator that you have where you actually come up with a move needs to be super easy to use, otherwise people won't use it. And if people aren't using it, the player emergent behavior doesn't happen and bad things continue from there. So if we were to take that, we can actually go bigger. So we've taken Pokemon, we've added the ability to create moves, and it affects other people, and the content, the amount of content in the game, the amount of gameplay has expanded. What if the new move that we were creating was actually dependent, the ability to create it was dependent on found objects, like gemstones or ingredients of some kind? What then? That would actually encourage people to play the game in order to create the content. And that way you create this ongoing cycle of people. It helps encourage the actual use of that tool. So for example, in order to create a move that used a fire attack, I have to find a ruby. So I can only find a ruby by traveling around the world and so on and so forth to actually, and traveling around the world starts implementing gameplay elements like battles and things like that. So when you have the battles, you're fighting against creatures that might have an ability that somebody else has created somewhere else. So it actually creates this cycle and perpetuates it. Making use of the player emergent behavior only works if people are actually using it. So this sort of thing can double up as enhancing the player emergent behavior and forcing them to use it. And if you find that balance, it can actually be quite a self-perpetuating system. However, there are ways you can make it even bigger, like adding a store system where if you do find a ruby and you know somebody else needs a ruby but you don't, you could actually trade it with them. Adding something like that. I mean, they already have that in a lot of MMOs, but what if it's procedurally player emergent created content that people are actually selling? Then you can actually create a guild or faction system that monitors the trade of these items that's actually player controlled, not dev controlled. And that would actually create a full economy system in the game. So it's ways you can make it bigger and bigger and bigger. Now that you're actually thinking about it, does anybody have any ideas of how you could make that even bigger? Crickets. Yeah.
Open source?
Yeah, open source is okay, but if you're trying to guide a player emergent behavior, you don't want to put the guidance of the player emergent behavior in the hands of player emergents, because that would just, it's not your game anymore, essentially.
But if you want a game to last indefinitely, I mean, you know.
Oh, there would come a point. I mean, I'm all for open source, but in this particular aspect of game development, I would say that if you are handing over the ability to create the systems of the game to the people and hoping that they will, then you may as well not have made the game in the first place.
Well, look at games like, say, Doom. They released the source code for that a long time ago, and the community is bigger than it's ever been now.
Yep, but they did it at the end of the lifespan of the product. I'm talking about while you're actually making it. This talks more about as you're developing the game, rather than at the end of the life cycle. By all means, I'm very much pro open source, and if your product does get to the end of its life, I say go for it.
Or you could add a simulation aspect instead of a first person, so that at some stage, for example, in Minecraft, the player could control an entire region and their NPCs.
Yeah,
Setting up rules.
absolutely. Yeah, like a governance system even. Yep.
You've mentioned a lot about like player movement in the world, how that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
If your server like kept track of all the player movement over the lifetime of the game, you could like see encouragement to move to areas that haven't been.
That's very true, like a migration system and monitoring, tagging players to actually see where they swim to. That would be fantastic. You could actually control that, the issuing of that information to actually say, if you are running a shop that sells these things, this is the place to build it. And that information might actually be valuable. So yeah, that helps the economy.
Introduce as like imbalance.
Yeah?
Like allow a player to be really powerful, but then, naturally create him as an enemy kind of thing.
That's true. It could actually have like a reputation system. So as you got nastier, you got more hated. There was one over there.
Yeah, you could put injectable source and at least expose an API.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to do it during the development, yeah, because then it starts getting people coming out with things, yeah.
I don't really understand why it's absolutely necessary for the developer to have, in the end, like a fail-safe, like it's my game, like what if they just take it and run with it? Is it a case of making money or something like that? I mean, it depends what your motivations are, I guess.
Well, I'm actually talking about the opposite of that. I'm talking about actually putting the content creation in the hands of the players.
Yeah.
So it's actually not that at all. So, yeah.
What is your opinion on Steam Workshop and getting players to actually get involved in the art creation?
Well, this is actually kind of what I'm talking about. If you were to implement it into the game and do it right, do it well, have an easy-to-use system and a system that flows well enough, then you don't actually have to have a third-party product doing that for you. You can actually have this happening in your game now, because that sort of thing is super cool until you get the inevitable penis textures on everything. But it is super cool, and that's why you've got to guide it so that it stays within the bounds of your design, your idea. But at the same time, if you're going to be open to the idea of allowing emergent content to be in your game, then I say implement it in your game and not have to rely on something third party. Yeah, was there another one somewhere? Yeah.
DayZ has made a lot of changes based on player behaviours throughout its whole development. And one of the things that players hated a lot, but eventually became quite a massive thing on the internet, was the ability to ruin gameplay for other people with items like handcuffs and burlap sacks that you put on their heads, enslaving other players. And that's their character, and that's all they can do is be captured by other people.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I was talking about with the keeping things balanced, because that sort of thing of being able to arrest a player in some way so they can't move or can't see. If you're that guy, it sucks. It's horrible. Yeah. But if you're that guy and it leads to something, then it can become a gameplay element rather than being something out of control.
Role-playing involved, they seem to enjoy more.
Yeah, what if that automatically put them into a situation of having to escape from a compound? Or something like that? That would end up being quite cool. And then the people have designed that compound themselves and put their own traps and things like Dungeon Keeper. You can actually take that sort of thing and run with it. But if you don't put those, I hate to use the term blinkers, but of some sort of guidance, even if it's just vague guidance, then it can get out of control and, like you said, ruin the gameplay experience for some people. And a lot of people will say, well, that guy shouldn't have gotten to that situation. That's just part of the game. But and when you think about it, and we're making video games, I mean, the whole point of a video game is for you to actually be able to play this thing and have fun. I remember I tried, I can't remember the name of it, I have a mental blank. It's a fairly recent indie game where you start out with just a loincloth and a rock. And Sorry? Rust. Yeah, that's it. And I had to start a new character, I think it was 18 times, because I'd start a game and somebody would hit me on the head with a rock and steal my rock. And that's all I had in the world. I had just a rock. So I eventually got in my head that, all right, as soon as I spawn, I've got to sprint. And I had 3 people chase me for 25 minutes to get my rock. I eventually outran them on the 5th attempt, but I finally got away and I had my rock. And I'm like, yes, I finally have my rock. And what can I do now? So I figured out that you can actually you can use that rock to hit like a pig. And I thought, yes, I'll be able to get meat. Hit the pig, and it says you can't do anything unless you have an axe. And so that was cool. If I hadn't have had to go through, if I hadn't have just experienced that massive frustration of just being completely overpowered and bopped on the head and killed as soon as I started 18 times in a row, I would have had more patience to think, all right, well, how do I make an axe? Let's figure this out. But I just rage quit the whole thing. So it's kind of, I sort of see something like that, and I think I've got this great, huge, big world on these servers. What if they just made the players' start locations be a bit more random, so that not everybody's starting in the same spot and just murdering everybody that spawns? That doesn't affect the gameplay that much. It's just guiding them into being able to have a little bit more freedom. It's still dangerous. There's still other people out there. You can even make them spawn within a certain radius of somewhere, just so they have the opportunity to run. That is an example of that sort of that guidance of, but still allowing the freedom. So yeah. So, like I said, it's dancing a really thin line. So on one hand, the key to the emergent behavior is that if it is emergent, so if you're actually controlling it, it won't happen. They have to do it by using the structures that you've built, like strafe jumping in Quake 3. They have manipulated a physics system that id Software wrote. They made it in a particular way to follow a particular set of rules. And the emergent behavior was that they found that if you hit and hold the jump button while you're falling back to Earth, you will bounce and you can get huge speeds up. So that speed makes it almost impossible to actually hit the person. You're trying to line them up and they just boom, 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 like Skippy the kangaroo. That's the sort of thing that was not controlled, but it was still within boundaries of the physics system. Even though you could strafe jump and get up to ludicrous speeds, your height wasn't affected. It was still, you still had momentum, so you couldn't just go around a corner like that. You'd slam into the wall and have to start again and things like that. But if you ease back on those restrictions too much, you end up getting just everybody creating everything. Overpowering will happen. The balance will get skewed. What your tools are is essentially the ability to create content which is balanced. And that's what it comes down to. And to actually create that balance where it's not too controlled and not controlled enough is this really, really hard, thin line to actually dance on. So it's one you've got to be aware of. And does take a lot of testing, but having like an open beta is a good way to do that. And remember, every time you do it with one game, you will learn things for the next game, and so on and so forth. I imagine here everybody that makes games isn't going to finish the project they're working on and then just say, I quit, and leave. They're going to be making more games, so use it as a learning experience. You're trying to encourage people to display emergent behavior. You're not trying to control it. You're not trying to do anything else. I've got a example here. You're just chucking fertilizer on the ground and making sure the garden bed's nice. You don't know what's going to grow. Something's going to grow in there eventually. You just make sure that it's a healthy environment for it to grow. That's what you're trying to do. So, yeah, it's a very, very powerful force, emergent behavior, and you don't want to control it. You've got to be aware of what you're doing so that you're not controlling it, because if you are controlling it, it is not emergent. It is controlled behavior. It's basically people trying to just play the game based on how you're doing it. If you want people to come up with their own content, their own ways of playing, and I must stress that when I say content, I don't just mean 3D models or creatures or textures or anything like that. I mean ways of playing. An economy in a game is not a tangible thing, but it is a thing. It is content that people experience. So you don't want to control the way that they do it. You just want to guide it. And you don't want to stop it from happening if this is what you want. Because if you have a procedurally generated game, that repetition is going to happen no matter how intricate your procedural generation is. It's just going to happen. Things are going to just start looking procedural after a while. So you want to guide that emergent behavior to affect everybody else's game. And you want it to happen in a natural way, not in a controlled way. Otherwise, it's just cold and people won't play it. It's been tried before. There are games that are already doing this. EVE Online is probably the best example I can think of. If you want to look into it more, it's very much worth having a bit of a read up on some of the events that have happened within that game. But other than that, if you've got any questions specifically, then feel free to ask. Yeah?
What software are you using? Your game development?
C# at the moment, Visual Studio. But in the past, when I'm knocking together a prototype for something, I actually use the Dark GDK. It's from a company called The Game Creators in the UK, just because it's really fast to make really intricate things. So prototyping for me is the key to development. I'll try and knock together something quickly if it's a new idea, see if it works, and then I'll implement it properly.
Are you downloading third-party asset packs?
No, I'm a 3D animator by trade, so I can knock things together really, really fast.
What about server-side, AWS?
I actually do most of my stuff with just PHP calls on a SQL database. I know it's very outdated and horrible, but nothing that I ever have had to do so far requires anything more.
How many players are on it?
Currently 3,500. Yeah. Yep.
This is about your project specifically. What do you think is best as a sort of philosophy towards procedural generation? Do you think it's more important to write algorithms and provide control before the data comes, or do you think it's more important to be able to reject something after it's already been created? Do you use both of those?
what I like to think of it as is kind of like a funnel that starts out quite wide, and all of the information and data of what players are doing comes in. And I, as time goes on, try and narrow it down a little bit. So when I first created the engine, I made it very, very open. People could do all sorts of things, but I quickly found that a lot of things didn't work. A lot of things would break. A lot of balancings were completely off. And as that data came to me, I was able to refine it more and more and more to get the experience as natural as it can be. And I'm still going with it, to be honest. I'm still implementing new things which change data, but a lot of the new content that I add now at this point in the game is actually based on player behavior. I'll see that people are trying to wrangle one particular thing in the game and think, well, so many people are trying to make this happen. Why don't I just give them the ability to do it without having to work so hard for it?
You record and then visualize the data that's coming back from the players?
Most of their activity is actually monitored on the server, just for the people that actually want to. I've got from the original group of players that started out. It started out with 11 people, and now there's about 250 who basically will send me information about their character in real time, how far they travel, how much gold they spend, what sort of quests they take on, which ones they fail on, and things like that. But I also, more than anything, I just try and go onto I've set up a forum for the game, and I just try and talk to the people and listen to them, because they will tell you, even if it's people complaining. Usually people are complaining because there is something that I've done wrong, rather than a miscommunication or something. They'll say, oh God, the monsters in this dungeon are just too bloody hard. And I'll say, well, what level are you? And they'll say, oh, I'm level 26. And I'll say, is anybody else having this problem? And if everybody else goes, no, I'm level 24 and having no problems, then I'd know that it's just one person having a bit of a whinge. But if everybody else starts saying, yeah, it's really bad, I'd take a look at the monster balancing. And a lot of the times I'll actually take the data and write a whole new program that just charts it and extrapolates it out to level 500. And then I'll see that it's just sharply going up too much. So I need to adjust the algorithms to make it increase a bit more slowly. Yeah.
Is this feedback sort of thing, is it like personalized to you specifically, or is there some kind of automation that can sort of determine and make decisions for you? You know, like you have a way of like analyzing statistics, like different.
Like I was saying, I just collect a bit of everything, and then when I need specific information about a particular area, I'll just write a quick little charting app that takes the information and then extrapolates it based on patterns.
There's a lot of libraries and algorithms that do these sort of things, but and they're really easy to implement. But you should look at some sort of statistical analysis algorithms.
Well, actually.
Tell you if this guy was doing such and such if such a condition happened on a guy's experience, it'll also highlight for you and say there's a relation between this and another thing that happened.
I'm quite odd when it comes to programming. I don't like using other people's modules, so I'll often write them myself. I've actually written whole statistical measuring applications that I'm constantly expanding as new situations arise, because the nature of player emergent behavior is that new situations will always arise, no matter what you do. So I've got these metric systems that are just, if anybody else looked at the code, they'd just slap me, I think. But I'll constantly be adding to it to try and keep on top of that information. And like I said, I was talking and listening to the community is what tells me what areas I need to be looking at. Yep.
So I was watching some dev commentary on No Man's Sky. They basically said that they couldn't have developed the game if they had used another engine. So could you, from your own experience, find that might be the same thing?
When I first started making Malevolence, I tried using Unity, and it didn't handle it. I'm not saying that Unity can't handle an infinite game world. I'm saying that I couldn't get Unity to handle it. It could just be my experience with programming it. But I just had nothing but difficulty with it, which is why I ended up writing my own engine, which is a terrible idea, by the way. Just don't do it. More pain than it's worth. But it's, hindsight's 20/20. But I totally understand them saying that, because when you start dealing with a world that's that big, in a way, it's to do with this topic. emergent behavior can happen with a developer as well. And all of a sudden, a programming language just isn't fit for what is coming out of developers' minds anymore. And most languages do tend to put out new versions and keep on top of that quite well, but others don't. Others that may have worked for your games 10 years ago just aren't fit for them now. So the developers of No Man's Sky, by the time they're completely finished and done with it, they'll probably look at the developer scene and see new languages that would have been incredible for them and new engines that would have just cut their workload in half. But at the time, they didn't exist or they weren't experienced enough in them. So, yeah. Yep.
You gave a basic example of how to procedurally generate a world.
Yes?
How are you doing it? And if you put chaos in it, is it different every time?
No, it's the same every time. I won't go into too much detail about how I'm doing it because I'd have to kill you. Malevolence is the first infinite game world. There's a lot of games that have effectively infinite game worlds that you'd never be able to reach the end in a million years, but Malevolence has actually gone past that, so it's a bit of a trade secret. But it's the sort of thing that you can, creating something procedurally, especially on that scale, is very difficult to debug when you have a problem. If you have somebody that says, 10 million miles that way, there is a dungeon that's upside down. And I'll say, has anybody else seen one anywhere else? And they say no. So I can't, in a fixed game like Skyrim that you've hand designed the entire thing, you can just take yourself over to that bit of code, fix it up, turn it right way around, done, patch goes out. In a procedurally generated game, that dungeon doesn't exist until you're actually standing next to it, so to speak. So you have to go find where it is, see what's happening, and trace the code back to your core creation algorithm and reverse engineer it to find out what could possibly have made that happen in that one instance. And then try and work out what happened. So you want to try and keep your procedural world generation algorithm to be as little chaos as possible, because having to reverse engineer back to that is a pain in the ass, I can tell you now. So what you want to do is to let it create the world and then sort of have a veneer that goes over the top of that, which is the chaos created by the player emergent behavior, and you can guide that. Much easier to do than to actually do it at the generation level. Does that make sense?
So it's more like weather, or sort of like...
Oh,
just that make it look like...
anything. So, for example, you have in your generation algorithm, you have a little bit of something that creates a shop in a town. So every town that has a shop uses that same bit of code, but different data is fed into it based on, say, player position or whatnot, so it'll be a different shop. Then on top of that, somebody has actually found that shop. A real player has actually found that shop for the first time, and they see it, and it goes up to the server and gets logged that there is a shop at this point. At that point there, you could then get that player to say, take ownership of that shop, and it logs it next to that piece of information on the database. Rather than having to, at your creation level, say, all right, this shop will be open for this player and so forth, and having to do it that way. That's right, it's sort of like layers. Yeah, your world creation layer won't have the chaos implemented into it, but the way that the world, once it is created, is affected, will be.
So you're working on one persistent world?
Yes, that's right.
Does that make it progressively more difficult to do anything with it?
No, because it all uses the same generation algorithm, even though it's...
Does it change it ever? When you can't, right?
Oh, that's right. I'm at the point now, before I went live with it, I made it so that I was 100% sure that I was happy with the way it was. Anything that I do since has to be on that veneer level, not on the generation level, because if I change just one thing, just the placement of sheep, then the entire world changes. Everything goes completely kaput. Yep.
So everyone who plays games in the same world, even though they're single players, the same one that's created from the algorithm?
Yeah, basically, in the way the story explains it is that everybody is playing the same person at different points in time. So everyone is experiencing the same world, however, you never see another person. When you are being able to trade items through the dimension stones, it's a portal back in time to somebody else. And so it's sort of like the letterbox. Is that the name of the movie? It's a bit like that.
So there is, the stuff doesn't come from nothing. There has to be a base, something to start with, it could just be a random number generator with a seed that's constant. What happens to your project when someone uses a debugger to find that 32-bit integer and change it? Everybody can change the whole game.
Lots of people have tried, and they've all tried on the assumption that it works in a way that currently exists. They've all been looking for things like a seed or something like that, but there isn't one. I actually created a new form of procedural generation to make Malevolence work, which in hindsight was pointless, because even if you take a game that's essentially infinite, it still may as well be infinite because you'll never reach the edge. Sort of like a Minecraft world, you'd have to hold down the move forward button for 800 years to actually get to the end. And making a game essentially infinite is much easier, because there's actually a point of reference. In an infinite world, there's no center, there's no point of reference for position or anything like that. So it actually created, it seemed like a cool idea at the time, created no end of problems for me as a developer. But if somebody is able to actually reverse engineer the new type of procedural generation that I've created, then there's nothing that I can do about that. So unfortunately, hacking and unwanted modding and things like that is part of releasing a game. If I didn't want people to do that, if it was dead against people doing that, I would be an engineer or something rather than a game developer.
This is what I mean. People are going to run with it eventually because someone will eventually find a way.
I think you're overestimating the popularity of my game.
Well, as someone who likes to break everything, I'm already thinking what it is to beat you.
Yeah, well, give it a go. But to beat me implies that there's a competition. I don't really care. I just want people to have a fun game.
Someone would just release a mod, and it's just like copy and replace this EXE into the game folder, and then you can have any new infinite world that you want. It's inevitable. You can't stop.
The funny thing is, I've had so many people contact me and say, I don't want to be in the same world as everybody else. I want to have my own unique experience, my own layout, my own dungeons and all that sort of thing. And the fact is, it's an infinite world. If you want that, just walk that way. You'll find it. You'll find a place. I've actually got a player tracking system in the game that actually tells you if you're the first person to ever discover a particular area. And people, funnily enough, of all of the emergent behavior, that's the thing that people value the most. They don't care about their loot or anything like that. They care about how many places they've discovered.
Do people start kind of a localized...
Everybody starts in exactly the same spot. Yeah.
Changing that.
Yeah.
There could be obstacles as you...
But there's already a thing for that as well. When you start, you're given the option to actually be flung off somewhere random if you're sick of the starting spot. So that's already taken care of as well. Like I said, people did want that, and they talked about that on the forum. I listened to them and I put it into the game. So when people actually want something bad enough, I do implement it for them. So, yep, sorry you've been waiting a while.
So forgive my ignorance, I haven't played your game yet.
No, most people haven't.
Yeah, so do you give your players value to the game when they find a new environment or a new place? Do they get to name that place?
No, we originally did, and then all of the inevitable names started coming out. So we ended up making it so that they can name their player whatever they want, and then it gets attached permanently to that thing. But we've also got things like leaderboards. So if you've survived to level 300, then that's amazing. And when you finally do die, you get put onto the leaderboard, and everybody sees that. There's actually a little temple thing in the towns that you can actually see. It's been chiseled on that's permanently there, even if they've died. And it'll actually tell you whether or not they're alive or not now. So once they've been deceased, you can start catching up on them and try and beat them. So that sort of ownership is good. But we're actually putting in more. The next piece of online functionality I'm putting in, which I haven't actually announced to the public yet, so it's a bit of a sneak preview, is we're actually putting in corpses. So when a person is going through a dungeon and dies, their corpse remains there, and the next person that happens to walk into that dungeon will see that corpse and be able to loot it. However, not all of their loot will be left there, just key items, but those items will be renamed after that player. So I might, you might find a sword on my corpse and it'll be called Alex's Slayer or something like that. And that ends up being, it's taking that legendary items thing to a whole new level, because we're also going to be putting in dynamic quests. So a quest might actually be to find this particular legendary weapon that is actually legendary from a level 150 character that still is out there in this particular dungeon. And you have to actually go and find it and collect it. And you know that that was a real person that died, and that real person had used that real weapon, and so on and so forth. So it adds that sense of ownership to it. So yeah, you guys had some questions?
A good example of like emergent seeding, because you could have like scavengers in the game, like enemies who will be attracted by the corpses.
Yep, and then you have to hunt down that monster to get back.
Yeah.
So you guys still had one, or yep?
Have people started mapping out the
Oh yeah. There's a huge forum thread for it. I don't know why they're doing it, but that's just because I'm the developer and it doesn't make sense to me. But yes.
Are your loot spawns like randomly or procedurally generated?
There are key items like ingredients which aren't procedurally generated, but all the weapons and armor are. And also spells are about to be. I'm implementing a new magic system at the moment, which is different to anything that you'd normally see in a game like with spellbooks and scrolls. Currently, Malevolence has the standard finding spellbooks and scrolls. I hate that. I put that in there as a temporary measure for magic until I get the proper one put in. The new one is actually uses a system of crafting, and it's actually going to be the sorts of things that it will be, when you find one, it'll be procedurally generated as well. So just adds that more sense of uniqueness. I like that people can find things that nobody else has found before. So yeah, did you still have one?
Yeah. What benefit would you think there would be, if any, to procedural generation at a very small scale? So if you had a game where you're expecting people to play for maybe 5 or 10 hours and not necessarily a roguelike, do you think that it would be worth having it to have interaction between different players because they have different experiences, or do you think it's totally a waste of time?
Well, I think you've almost answered your own question. I mean, roguelikes are the perfect example of using that sort of procedural generation for a short game span. But, I mean, how many people here play roguelikes? Yeah, they're great fun, awesome fun. I've been playing one that's sort of a roguelike at the moment that's taken a very new spin on it, Heavy Bullets. It's roguelike sort of system, but it's a new spin on it, and I kind of like it. But imagine it, if you already are having fun with roguelikes, if you can think of adding in that player emergent behavior that's actually crosses across people's versions of the game, and that idea sounds fun to you, I say go for it. I mean, there's no reason that you couldn't. I mean, people wouldn't be playing long enough for there to be a large-scale economy or a governance system or something like that, but there are plenty of things like item creation or legendary items that could persist over multiple games, which would be perfectly viable for it. So, yeah.
Do you think that outside of roguelikes there would be any appeal to that sort of short span procedural generation, like a game that you'd only play once?
Well, I can think of even Ski Safari, like I was talking about. If there were items that you could find in Ski Safari that were actually based on the activities of other players, that would be quite cool, especially if they were hard to come by. You know, you want to try and maintain that feeling of something being special when you find it. And if you can have that as well as it being something that's built out of player emergent behavior, then that makes it even more special. So, yeah.
I'm primarily an artist and designer, so I'm not like very knowledgeable about all the programming and architecture on the server side and stuff. But I'm really interested to know what your top 5 types of data that you record from player activity is, and in order of the usefulness in terms for creating emergent systems like that.
Well, the first one would probably be the claiming of locations as being they're the first person to discover it, because that shows me, I mean, I've got an infinite world, and like I was saying, people like to map it. I have my own sort of map, which isn't actually showing where locations are, it just shows how people spread, and showing, I can actually pump in, take down the data from player claiming and put it into my system. It'll tell me the furthest distance that somebody's actually traveled in the game, which is very cool. I think that the record is something like the equivalent of 550,000 miles, which is redonkulous. As a point of reference of how far people spread, Skyrim has, I think it's 717 unique locations in the entire of the Skyrim world, which is, you know, a big game world. Malevolence, they've just passed 26,000 unique locations that they've found and claimed. And that's just the people who play the game online. There's a lot of people that play it offline and don't claim locations. So that's just gives you a sense of the scale, and that sort of thing shows me also, do people spend most of their time in Arctic environments? Do people spend most of the time in desert environments, and so on and so forth? After that, it would probably be spending habits, because if people are working their asses off to get gold together to buy potions all the time, then it means that I'm not spawning enough potions. Things like that are very handy. Also, the types of monsters that people kill, I'll record, because if I get very, very few people killing ogres, it's either because ogres are too strong and just killing everybody, which I can compare to the cause of death report and find out if that's the thing. I may have to dial back ogres, or it could be that people are taking on quests that only involve goblins and things like that, which means they're avoiding the ogres for a particular reason, and that is just as bad. If you've got something in a game that's universally hated, it probably isn't a good idea to keep it there, or keep it the way it is. So they're probably the things that attract the most. Yeah. Yep.
What's the other average character life length?
It depends who you ask. From the people who take the game really seriously, they tend to cap out around level 26 before dying. But if you ask everybody else that's tried the game, then they'll probably say about level 2. It's deliberately been made to be an incredibly difficult game because it's modelled off the old school RPGs of the early 90s, which the sort of game like, who played Isle of Terror, Might and Magic 3 Isle of Terror. You die in the starting town. It's a town. You're supposed to be safe. You start a new game and then a moose rat busts through a wall and kills you. I loved that. There was a sense of risk because you had, especially with an RPG, with the character management and item management and all that sort of thing, there's this investment into that party. So dying is a much bigger deal than something like Call of Duty, where you just get a bullet in the head and you spawn again and you keep going. So I wanted to try and recreate that. I wanted people to actually have fear of their character dying, especially why I put in a permadeath option. Yeah.
Did you ever play the roguelike Angband or any of the bands?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like that, like any game like Diablo, you have the town and you're safe. But like an Angband, a rogue hobo will come and hit you.
Yeah. You've got to have that fear in an RPG. The fear is gone in modern RPGs. I mean, Daggerfall was a hard game to play. You would die a lot. And a lot of that, if you go back and play it now, is because the control system was insane, trying to swipe your mouse to move the sword. I saw what they were going for. It was kind of cool, but they didn't quite pull it off to make it easy enough to play. But then you play Skyrim, and it's almost impossible to die after you go up a few levels. You play that for 20 hours, and by the end of it, you're lolloping through the countryside with a full suit of Daedric armor, just cutting people's heads off, laughing. So it's you got to find that balance. You got to have people have fear. Yeah.
So cultures are a big thing in games. So I guess, have you found that Malevolence has developed its own little subcultures within the game?
It's it happened in currently the game doesn't have enough player ownership to really push that. I'm working on it, and it will have it by the time it hits 1.0, but at the moment it doesn't. But what I have found is, in lieu of that, people have actually, because the game is a classless game, you don't say, I'm starting as a fighter. You start as nothing. You start as a scavenger, a bottom feeder that slinks between dungeons trying not to attract anybody's attention while you gnaw on stale bread. That's how you start in the game. How you act in the game defines the sort of character you are. And so people have started defining themselves by classes throughout the community. They say, oh, my paladin or my fighter or whatever, even though that's not in the game and not mentioned ever in the game. It's just classless, completely classless, but because of the way people act. But the thing is, the game, the stat system in the game doesn't work as a set of stat points. It works as a set of stat percentages, all of which add up to 100. So if you keep hitting things with a sword, your magic's going to start going down as your strength buffs. And because of that, a fighter could turn into a mage if they suddenly find an awesome spell and use nothing but that for a while. So people seem to define themselves by classes, even though it's a classless system. But I'm hoping to encourage more of a culture system as time goes on and more interaction happens.
So I guess my next question is, are you using any other external forms of social engineering, not just in the game, but outside the game, like in the forums, you kind of seeding ideas there as well?
I like to, quite a bit. I tend to not go into it because people start thinking, oh, I'm being manipulated. But it's like I was saying about that guidance of the emergent behaviour. It's sort of like, I mean, I'm assuming that most of you at least have played Dungeons and Dragons at some point. But if you're a DM and you're running a campaign, you don't want to let your players just be like, you know what, fuck this quest, I'm going to head off into that mountain there because that looks fun. Because the DM hasn't prepared that mountain there. That was just a bit of the scenery. So you've got to try and keep them guided. Even though they can do whatever they want as players, you've got to just sort of, you know, sheepdog them a bit to try and keep them on the right path. And sometimes that requires a little bit of subtle prodding. So I try not to do it too much, but depends on, it usually comes down to little hints about what's coming. Like the most recent major update that I did actually had a new dungeon tile set called the Tombs. You go into these sort of undead crypts, and there are statues in there that if they're facing this way and you walk up to it, if you look at it, the head starts turning towards you, and if the head actually locks eyes with you, you get poisoned. So you've got a couple of seconds before the head actually finds you, but I didn't tell them how they worked. I just said, you know, watch out for the skeleton statues, which of course made everyone go, what are they talking? So little things like that, it seems like a very subtle thing, like I think, oh yeah, the developer thinks it's a cool little tidbit about the update, so he's letting it on. But it actually made everybody run straight to a crypt and walk up to the statues, which made everyone terrified of them, because that started, we've got a large community of Let's Players, so they'll put up YouTube videos of them playing the game and narrating it as they play. And as soon as the update went out, there was this slew of people. I was watching them and just crying. I was laughing so much because people would go in, scream so much that it just clips the microphone. And because the skeleton screams this ungodly banshee scream and the eyes light up green and things, it's very creepy. But people, you'd have Let's Players do that, scream, go, oh my God, I hate Alex, I hate him. And they'd be walking around and they'd see on their minimap there's another skeleton statue nearby. It's like, all right, we've got to be really careful. And then their torch goes out. And there's a whole new experience of fear. And you just hear them sweating and breathing heavily into the microphone, like, oh God. And then it goes off again in the darkness and they see the two eyes light up and they're, ah! And that sort of thing is really fun for me, but that's a whole new experience for them. And when they put it out as a Let's Play video, that encourages other people to see it and go, oh, I've got to check this out. This is awesome. And it spreads. It's like I was saying, it's sort of like if you are having these emergent reaction is still emergent behaviour. I mean, for me, the skeleton statue is like, all right, there's one, I'm going to walk this way and just sort of make sure I don't look at it. This is sort of part of the gameplay for me now. But if you haven't experienced it before, different people react in different ways. Some people do the whole not looking at them thing, but other people try and sprint past them while looking at them just to see if they can be quick enough. And that sort of behaviour influences the way they play the game. So it's cool. You've got to try and monitor that. And sometimes you do have to prod. So, yeah. Do you have another one?
Do you think there's a reason why procedural generation is really strongly associated with dungeons and hack and slash games?
I think it's one of the, when it first started, I mean, not sure how good your video game history is, but back in the day that computers were filling a whole room, a really good reference for this story, by the way, is the book Masters of Doom. If you can track it down and read it, amazing read. The computers that people were using to make games weren't even in people's houses yet. Their attitude was, why the hell would I need a PC in my house? That makes no sense. So the people that did have them were big businesses and universities. And the university students that were learning to write these things so they could have a bright future in this new burgeoning home technology sort of thing, were geeks, playing D&D in their spare time and all that sort of thing. So naturally, when they first started making games, one person who wasn't that much of a geek actually liked spelunking in caves. That was his whole thing. And he actually wrote a text-based cave exploration simulator. It would actually tell you what the room was like and all that sort of thing. And then people naturally took that and modded it, completely tore it down and modded it to be things like, I've gone blank on the name. Sorry? No, even before that. Sorry? No, there's text-based text adventure. Zork, that's the one. Yeah, that sort of thing. Text adventures, which because of the type of demographic of people that were getting into computer science was usually around D&D and that sort of thing. And as things went on, they started actually having more of the map shown on the screen with ASCII characters, which is where your roguelikes come from and all that sort of thing. And it's expanded from there. And it's purely because if football linebackers were interested in writing computer software, I'm sure it would have started out with procedurally generated sports simulators. I think it was just sort of that. Why it hasn't progressed from there since, it hasn't, I'm not entirely sure, but if you do look at it with games like Grand Theft Auto and things like that, you start getting a little bit more integration of procedural generation and content like that, but it's when you break it all down, it is the same game. It's just wearing a different jersey, essentially. But I would like to see more of it used, which is why I'm giving this talk, because a lot of people are sort of shying away from it. But back in the days of those old computers, they had like 8 megabytes of RAM, of hard drive space total, and that was huge at the time. So you can actually have pre-made content. They had to actually procedurally generate because they were trying to fit, like I was saying, that amazing game K. Krieger, the entire game, 3D game, fits in 96 kilobytes because of that procedural generation. So if you've got a computer that's got 1 meg of hard drive space free because of operating system and all that's been put on there, you've got to work within 1 megabyte. You want as much content in the game as possible because it gives you more gameplay as possible, so procedural generation is the answer, really. So.
Have you played Elite?
Yes.
So have you been inspired by that?
It wasn't a major inspiration, but it was for the technology, not so much the gameplay. I sort of see Elite as being the forerunner of something like No Man's Sky quite a bit. But I would love to make a procedurally generated space game at one point. But who knows what's on the cards for me. Malevolence will probably keep me busy for a while yet. And I'll often say this will be my next game, and then a year later when I'm still working on Malevolence, I'll completely have changed my mind. But the technology itself, I think, I'd like to think that a year from now there are a dozen mainstream games out there that have these amazing emergent behavior integrated procedural worlds. A game like Elite that actually is combined with the internet is going to be incredible. And I sort of see EVE Online as being a bit like that already. So I'm hoping that it's happening in the big games because they've got teams of 600 people working on them, but I'd really like to see indies actually take on the challenge. But the only thing I keep hearing is that a huge procedurally generated game, that's just sort of a novelty. It's not really worth going into. It'll all end up looking the same. Yep?
Can you explain your prototyping stage, and if there's like a starter world where you can sort of start experimenting with the generation of worlds?
Well, I actually wrote my own engine to be able to do that. But I have a system whenever I'm starting a new game that I'll give myself, I'll put aside a day, I'll just tell everybody, don't talk to me, don't call me. I'm going to dedicate 12 hours to making something. And if I can't make something that works and is kind of fun in 12 hours, I don't progress with that idea. And that's my entire prototyping stage. And Malevolence was no different. It started in the same way. I wanted to see, can I make a dungeon that goes on forever, that's interesting to play? It doesn't have to look pretty or anything. It was just blocks at the time, and the monsters were spheres. But it worked, and it was fun. And I could keep playing this dungeon sort of like an infinite roguelike. And the actual infinite world algorithm I came up with in college and then put away because I felt there was nowhere useful that I could actually apply it. And then when I had that prototype, I mixed it with the algorithm, and it worked.
You just jump away from C# and go into Dart at that point?
Yeah, when I'm doing the 12-hour thing, I'll use Dark Basic, which is made by the game creators. It's just because it's fast. It's very quick to use. C# is great. If you're going to actually make anything proper and real, you really want to start using C++ or C# or something like that, or using a professional engine like Unity or UDK, and then you can implement your C#. But it takes time, takes a lot of referencing and all that sort of thing. Dark Basic is the sort of thing that if you want to knock out something quick, dirty, and easy that just works, but not necessarily something you could actually sell, it's great.
Is there an engine in there? Is there
Yep. That's all handles your 3D and 2D and asset management and things like that you have to do. It's very, very bare bones. It's essentially, here's it's sort of like, the big white room in the Matrix. You can just start loading things in and you don't have to really think about it. It's kind of like that. It's not memory efficient enough and whatnot to actually be able to make a huge game and then push out, because you're going to start having all sorts of people having problems. It's forced into using DirectX 9. It won't allow anything more. It's capped at 2 gigabytes of RAM usage and things like that. So it's got a lot of problems, but if you're knocking together something really quick and you want to spend a day on something at most and still have 3D and 2D textures, sounds, all that sort of thing, fantastic. Yeah, but that's my view. It might not be good for anybody else. Sort of like 3D software. What you start out with is what you live and die by. You're a 3D Studio Max man or you're a Maya man. So, yeah.
I was reading about GA5 and how they use synthesizers for all their sounds, especially cars and stuff like that. So that's something like 30% of all the sound in GA5 is synthesized. Do you use procedural sound in Malevolence?
No. I actually have a composer who does it all. So.
Are you planning to, or is that just out of the...
I dabbled with procedural assets as well as the procedural world early on, and I realized that I'd already spent 2 years on the game at that point and I didn't want to finish the game and finally hit upload and be 90. So I thought, nah, stuff it. I'll save that for another game. If I was to combine Spore with Malevolence, it would probably make something incredible, but I'm one guy and I still have a day job. So I have very limited time and resources to be able to do this sort of thing. So I work on the written content, the stat content, the placement of objects in the world and things like that.
It's important to investigate this for other developers?
Absolutely. Procedural generation, in my view, is the future. I think that as games get bigger and people want more, especially when you start taking into account the vast increases in graphical capability, the more detailed visually a game gets, the harder it is for any one designer to actually sit there and place everything. I mean, if you look at any brick wall, if you think about it as a game developer, you would think, well, there's a plane and I'll put a bricks texture on it that tiles seamlessly. But if you look at a real brick wall in real life, that's not how it works. There's vines growing on it, there's dust, there's scorch marks from that one time a kid let off an M80 next to it. There's all that sort of thing is what makes it look real. So as games start getting more and more graphically intensive, all of those little nuances in texture and things. I mean, look at Carmack's megatexture system. Things like that, implementing the procedural generation into that starts adding that new layer of detail onto things. Or that local guy in Brisbane that actually made the infinite detail engine. Euclidean, yeah. Yeah. That's a story for a different day. But I've had some interesting interactions with them. But he did raise a valid point in that if you're going to have an infinite detail engine, by definition, somebody can't design those levels by hand. It just doesn't work. I mean, you can take an object in there, like he had like an elephant totem model in his demonstration that he could put in there that was an infinite detail item. However, while the designer could place that there, all of those elephants are going to look the same. So you back to the same problem that you'd have, and there was no point ever making an infinite detail version of that elephant. So creating the texture, there is actually a term for it, but it's a newish term that I always forget, but like the little irregularities in textures, creating them procedurally almost becomes a necessity when it comes to increasing the visual detail of a project. Yeah. So, is that everyone? Thank you. Sorry? I would love to get into that personally. I haven't done any for Malevolence. Like I was saying, the actual assets themselves are all handmade, but my experience with procedural generation has been positive enough that I want to try and start implementing it in as many different places as possible, within reason, of course. But yeah, I'm excited to see what can be created and what can come of it. So, yeah, I think that's everyone. Well, thanks very much for everyone for coming and listening to me blab on for 2 hours.